On Monday, 14th April 1746, Prince William, the Duke of Cumberland, and son of King George II, reached Nairn, only 16 miles away from Prince Charles Edward Stuart, who was in Inverness. Charles left the town that day and went to stay at Culloden House, the home of Lord Chief Justice Duncan Forbes. During his stay, he exuded confidence in the success against Cumberland and buoyed up the mood of those around him. On 15th April, Charles drew up his army at Culloden Moor to await the impending approach of the Duke of Cumberland and his army. Cumberland rested his troops that day, possibly because it was his birthday. It was proposed by Charles and Lord George Murray to take advantage of this and attack the Hanoverian camp at Nairn at night. However, before the troops could be mustered, it was already 8 o'clock in the evening, so 2 o'clock in the morning was chosen for the attack. The Highlanders set out in 2 columns, each keeping some distance from the other. Avoiding the public road, they took to the boggy ground, finding it difficult to traverse, and many of the men fell down exhausted. When the time approached the chosen moment for the attack, the first column had only reached the house of Kilravach, some 4 miles from the Duke's camp. The men retraced their steps, and the party arrived at Culloden Moor, broken down and dispirited. It had been a bad decision. It didn't help that some of the men under Ewan Macpherson of Cluny, George Mackenzie, Lord Cromarty, and Simon Fraser, Master of Lovat, hadn't yet joined. Neither Macpherson nor Fraser appeared on the battlefield, and Mackenzie was captured the day before and imprisoned at Dunrobin Castle in Sutherland. The men had also gone some time without food. On the morning of Wednesday 16th of April, Prince Charles could find no better refreshment than a morsel of bread and a glass of whisky to set him up for battle. Some of the foraging parties returned with a supply of provisions, but before they could be cooked, the enemy was seen in the distance, advancing across the moor. In all, there were around 5,500 men, starving and exhausted. They were about to face nearly 8,000 men in good physical condition and well supported by horses and artillery. The outcome was inevitable. The Highlanders were drawn up in 2 lines. On the right was the first line, commanded by Lord George Murray, which consisted of Athelmen, the Camerons, the Stuarts, the Frasers, the Macintoshes, the Farquharsons, and some other clans. On the left was the second line, commanded by Lord John Drummond, composed of MacDonalds of Clanranald, Keppoch, and Glengarry. To the right, the men were protected to some extent by some park walls, and to the left by a piece of boggy ground. 4 pieces of artillery were placed at the extremity of each line, and the same number in the centre. On the right of the first line, and on the left of the second, was a troop of horse. There was also a reserve of regiment of foot guards, and some horsemen. The Hanoverian army was arranged in 3 lines. There was a body of cavalry on each wing, and 2 pieces of artillery between every 2 regiments in the front line. The Highlanders who supported the Hanoverians were told to guard the baggage. There was also some considerable dissent in the Highland army. The MacDonalds had always claimed the privilege of being on the right of the army. Being placed on the left caused them deep offence. One of their number later wrote, "We of the Clan MacDonald thought it ominous that we had not this day the right hand in battle, as formerly at Gladsmuir and Falkirk, and which our clan maintain we had enjoyed in all our battles and struggles, since the Battle of Bannockburn." The battle commenced with a cannonade from the Highlanders, which was ineffective and was swiftly returned by the other side. Gaps began to appear in the Highland lines. A well-aimed shot ploughed the ground at the feet of Prince Charles and covered him with dust, killing an attendant who was leading a spear horse close by him. For nearly half an hour, the government artillery kept firing on the ranks of their enemy. The Highlanders were hit badly and clamoured to be allowed to make an onslaught. A message was sent to Prince Charles begging permission to attack, but before the answer came, the Macintoshes rushed wildly on against the government centre, followed by the whole of the Highland right line. For a time, they swept aside all before them in their impetuous rush. The ranks of the enemy were broken, and it seemed as if the successful tactics of Killiecrankie were to be repeated. The Highlanders had, however, only broken one line to find themselves confronted with another. A bristling wall of bayonets opposed them, and when they got nearer to the wall of men, they received volley after volley of fire, so murderous at close quarters that they were said to have been found afterwards in layers of 3 or 4 feet deep. It had all been in vain. Donald Cameron of Lochiel, severely wounded at his ankles, was carried off by 2 clansmen to the rear. Almost every man in the front ranks was killed. Those who survived were driven from the field, which was covered by piles of bodies. The left wing remained, and those men acted with the courage of their comrades. The result could have been very different, but the MacDonalds stood sullen and motionless, cutting the heather with their broadswords. They would rather suffer defeat than forgive the insult they thought had been placed on them. Glengarry's regiment was commanded by James Drummond, the Duke of Perth, said to have been a brave and fearless man. In vain he cried, "Claymore." He called to the men to convert the left wing to the right, and said he would call himself MacDonald for the rest of his life if they would fight. The angry clansmen refused to move. Keppoch with a few followers rushed forward. However, his own clan remained where they were. He fell, pierced by musket balls, exclaiming, "My God, have the children of my tribe forsaken me?" They showed no willing to avenge his death. As the enemy came nearer, they turned their backs and marched out of the field without striking a blow. There now only remained the reserve line of the Prince's army. It had been reinforced by the remains of the right line and showed some willingness to make a stand, but Charles felt that nothing they could do would rescue the disaster of the day. It was then the Highlanders began to leave the field. A portion of the reserve line made the retreat in good order, with colours flying and pipes playing, while others sought their own safety as best they could. The battle was over, and the hopes of the Stuarts with it. Although the fight had been a brave one, it only lasted for about 40 minutes. Many tales throughout the Highlands tell of hand-to-hand combat between single Highlanders and the enemies with whom they were finally overpowered. A major of the Macintoshes, John Moore McGilvery, was seen as a gunshot passed the enemy's cannon, surrounded by government soldiers. He killed 12 men with his broadsword, while some of the halberts pierced his body. Another member of the same clan killed 7 of the Hanoverian soldiers with the tram of a pit cart before he was overpowered and killed. A Highlander known for his strength, Golas MacBain, was badly wounded, but placed his back to a turf wall and held his enemies off for some time. Though assaulted by a large force of dragoons, he held his own against them with his claymore and target. It's said some English officers shouted, "Save that brave fellow," as they saw the unequal combat. However, the dragoons, angry about the injuries inflicted on them, finally killed him, though not until 13 of their own men lay dead at his feet. There are stories of how many escaped with their lives from the carnage. Lochiel, as mentioned, was carried from the field on the men's shoulders as they crossed the River Nairn to a place of safety. Others, after lying on the field all night, crawled away to some sympathetic houses. Those who were wounded on the field received no mercy from the government soldiers, who went among them, stabbing them with their bayonets and swords. One English soldier later recorded that watching those men was like watching an army of butchers. The day after the battle, a search was made in the woods for any fugitives who'd sought refuge there, and those who were found were shown no mercy and murdered. A number of them were discovered in a ramshackle cabin, which was surrounded and set on fire. 32 burned bodies were found among the ruins. Any prisoners who were spared, and among them were some men of rank, were treated harshly. Some were thrown into the prison in Inverness, while others were confined to a church. Their wounds weren't tended to. Many were stripped of their clothing, and all of them almost starved. They were put on transports to be moved to London, and it's recorded that on one vessel 150 prisoners were confined in the hold, but only 49 were alive by the time they reached the city. The Duke of Cumberland will always be remembered in Scotland as Butcher Cumberland, or quite simply the Butcher. When the battle was over, he went to Inverness, where he occupied the same lodging in Church Street that Prince Charles had stayed in before him. Culloden was the last battle ever fought on Scottish soil. Estimates of those who died vary, but between 50 and 100 Hanoverian troops lost their lives. Approximately 1,400 Jacobites lost theirs, with over 370 taken prisoner. As for the defeated prince, a £30,000 price was put on his head by the government, but he managed to flee and spent the rest of his life in exile in Europe. The bounty was never paid. Known as the Young Pretender, Charles Edward Stuart died in Rome on 30th January 1788. If you enjoyed this episode of Scotland's History, please like, comment and subscribe. Until next time, thank you for watching.